Hello, my name is Emily Depew, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We'd like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you're interested. We recently implemented a new loop hearing system which is wired into the floor. It is available for use right now if you have a T-coil hearing aid. Listening devices are also available upon request. If you have any trouble hearing at any time, please raise your hand and a staff member will assist you. After the presentation, we'll have time for the audience to ask some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming the Director of the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Dave Cotter.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. We know you had a choice. It was Patrick Mahomes or us. We're glad you're here, so thank you. But we are heated, I will point that out. So today we get to hear Dr. Gates Brown, a member of the Department of Military History, discuss the Tet Offensive. Dr. Brown took his PhD right here at Kansas University. He's been with the Department of Military History for about 7 years. His expertise is largely in the Cold War, which of course encompasses this conflict. And he's the author of Eisenhower's Nuclear Calculus. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gates Brown.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon. So one of the things that often happens when you think about the Tet Offensive is it can get reduced down into a couple of short snapshots in a way, and people tend to infer that these are all connected in some sense. So it's obviously the beginning, where you've got this dramatic attack. And the one thing that people really will know is they'll have seen pictures or they will know that some of the attacks penetrated the U.S. Embassy. And then the next big thing that people will concentrate on is President Johnson deciding that he's not going to accept the nomination or run for re-election in 1968, which throws the presidential election into some tumult, which of course Richard Nixon will come out the victor in 68. And then the final thing that people kind of lump in together is 1975, tanks crashing down the gates of the President's Palace, and the Vietnam War ends. And I find with my students, oftentimes they want to connect all these things together as if they're in a causal chain. That because the Tet Offensive in some ways is a cause of Johnson's decision to not seek re-election in 68, that had to have been what the North Vietnamese wanted. And because in 68 they launched a Tet Offensive, and 7 years later they're coming down in tanks into Saigon, that these things have to be all part of one comprehensive campaign plan. And that's just not true. So a couple of questions that we're going to ask today to try to help get a better understanding of what's going on with the Tet Offensive. What did the Democratic Republic of Vietnam want to accomplish with the Tet Offensive? And then we'll look at what did Westmoreland and MACV holistically, the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, what did they think was happening in the final months of 1967 and then the Tet Offensive in early 68? And then what were the ramifications of the Tet Offensive? How do we get to Johnson deciding not to run in 68? What happens when President Nixon wins the election? And then what are the ramifications for U.S. policy inside of Vietnam? What are the ramifications for the Republic of Vietnam? And then what is the impact of this on the Democratic Republic of Vietnam? Now, one of the things we're not going to talk about a whole lot in great detail are a lot of the tactical actions, and that'll be evident as we get into the meat of the offensive. One thing is, it's not just the Tet holiday. This is something that's going to go throughout 1968. And so if we were to talk about all of the tactical actions, we'd be here into tomorrow, which nobody really wants. So the first thing we're going to look at is, what did the Democratic Republic of Vietnam hope to accomplish when they were planning the Tet Offensive and in that first phase during the Tet holiday? Now, one of the things that happens is when the United States senior leaders are looking at this conflict, they're thinking about, well, what would Ho Chi Minh do? Which we're all familiar with Ho Chi Minh. He's the man in the middle of the picture with his poster right behind him. So that's the face of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But in point of fact, in the middle of the 1960s, it's not Ho Chi Minh making those decisions. It's the guy who is on his right and our left of the picture, Le Duan. Le Duan is the man making these day-to-day decisions inside the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And in point of fact, the Tet Offensive is Le Duan's idea. So to understand the Tet Offensive, we first have to understand Le Duan. And he's going to be instrumental in the Vietnamese Workers' Party, not just in the 1960s, but throughout its existence in the 20th century. He's going to be in jail under the French when they had control of Indochina, and that's when he starts to be radicalized and starts to work towards Vietnamese independence. With the partition of Vietnam as a result of the Geneva Peace Accords, Le Duan is in the South, and he is part of the contingent that is ordered to stay in the southern part of Vietnam to continue his political work, to continue this ideological formation of the people of what will become the Republic of Vietnam, to be open to and excited for eventual unification and unification under a broader communist system. But as you get to the end of the 1950s, things are not going well in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. They've got some land reform problems, the economy's not working out, and members of the Politburo have some troubling associations with some of the policies of the government. And so people are frustrated. Le Duan is going to exploit this opportunity. He's going to move up into the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the early 1960s, late 1950s, and he's going to be able to rise to leadership of the Politburo. And in the middle of the 1960s, he is going to start putting his personal stamp on this in a much more dramatic fashion. Because what he wants to do is get to a decisive win. He wants to have a decisive campaign that's going to reunify Vietnam. And this is different than a more protracted approach, like General Giap wants. General Giap wants to drive the Republic of Vietnam into exhaustion, and then in the middle of the 1960s, when the United States comes in a much larger fashion, he wants to continue this exhaustion campaign and wage a protracted war against the United States. But that's not what Le Duan wants, because in the back of Le Duan's mind is what happened in 1954. And that is a decisive defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu, which the Vietnamese hoped to parlay into independence at the peace table in the Geneva Peace Accords. But in point of fact, the socialist powers of China and the Soviet Union force a division on the Vietnamese, one that Ho Chi Minh did not want. So what Le Duan's hoping to do with this decisive campaign is create a political reality that nobody will be able to question. And he tries this first in 1960, and then in 1965, and then finally in 1968. And he calls this the General Uprising, General Offensive. And the idea is, because of his knowledge of the South, he knows that there are a number of people in what is now the Republic of Vietnam who desperately want to overthrow the Saigon regime, which is true, because there are a lot of protests, there's a lot of dissatisfaction in the Republic of Vietnam. What Le Duan assumes, though, is because they want that political change, that they also want a communist revolution. And so what he wants to do is wage a military campaign that will provide some breathing space. It will lift this political oppression on these revolutionary elements allow them to overthrow the government in Saigon, and then there will be a revolutionary government that will take power. And that revolutionary government will have one mandate. And that mandate will be to reunify the Republic of Vietnam with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. A little fuzzy on the details exactly how that's going to work out, but the reason why this is going to be decisive is because no one will be able to question the finality of this decision, because it will be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people demanding political change. They will institute a new government that has one reason for its existence, and that is reunification. It doesn't work out in 1959 and 1960. But that's not because the idea is faulty, that's just because it wasn't planned well. So he tries again, 1964 and 1965. A little bit stronger of a conventional armed push, the general offensive part, that he hopes is going to be linked to a more broad-based uprising, but it actually doesn't work. And in point of fact, it's going to be the catalyst for deeper involvement of the United States in the Republic of Vietnam. And that's where Westmoreland's going to come in, and they're going to change the Military Assistance and Advisory Group Vietnam to the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. And that will be the beginning of what we talk about as the Vietnam War. The problem for Le Duan is this is a great cause of concern for Giap, because Giap doesn't know what to make of the U.S. involvement in the war. And he's going to caution that what they need to do is take a pause and wait. Of course, that gets away from Le Duan's idea of a decisive victory. Decisive victories usually aren't protracted, right? When we think about decisive conflicts, we think about Austerlitz, or we think about Jena Arstadt, we think about Operation Desert Storm in '91, where you've got a great violence of action that almost immediately leads to a resolution of the conflict. So Giap's counsel is we need to wait to see what the addition of U.S. forces does to the character of this war in Vietnam. But Le Duan's dissatisfied with that. And so he realizes he has to get more control over the Politburo in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And that's what's going to happen between 1965 and late 1967. Because in order to do the offensive that he wants to do the right way, he has to be the power in the Politburo. Instead of seeking consensus, he has to consolidate. And so there's going to be a great purge inside of the Communist Party in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. To such an extent that by the end of 1967, as they're making final determinations for the Tet Offensive, Giap is out of the country because he knows that his wing that's pushing a protracted war is not acceptable. In fact, his subordinates are going to find themselves in political prisons because of their pushing or alliance with Giap's plan of protracted war. Le Duan also has to consolidate power in terms of the debate inside the Democratic Republic of Vietnam about, do you focus on socialism in the North first, have a viable economy, have a successful experiment of this socialist model to entice the people in the Republic of Vietnam to join the North, or do you focus on revolution in the South and then worry about creating a viable economy later when Vietnam is unified? Well, Le Duan doesn't really want to wait. So these people who talk about having a viable economy in the North first before you reunify, that is not acceptable. So again, you have to purge those people. And so it takes a couple of years, but by the end of 1967, Le Duan is going to have the power inside of the Politburo. And we see that when he's looking at planning this, there are going to be a couple of different phases. And it's going to start before the Tet holiday. We think about the Tet Offensive and we think about that dramatic series of attacks that's going to start with broad-based attacks in the urban centers. But it actually is going to begin in late 1967. Because in order to make this general offensive work, you have to get the enemy on terms that you can fight him more reasonably or more successfully, which means you have to get the U.S. forces and allied forces away from the targets you want to hit. And so in the late part of 1967, you're going to see a lot more conventional activity in the Central Highlands of Vietnam that's going to require MACV to start concentrating its conventional combat power in those areas, which is away from urban centers. And then in the early part of 68, you'll have the Siege of Quezon, which again requires MACV to consolidate and concentrate its conventional power away from the urban centers where Le Duan is going to attack, and makes it more difficult for Westmoreland to reallocate combat power once the attacks begin. Because Le Duan wants to attack the ARVN, he wants to attack the government facilities of the Republic of Vietnam, he wants to attack the police. What he doesn't want to do is have to defeat the conventional forces of the U.S. and its allied nations. By 1968, what he hopes to do is, again, not conventionally defeat the United States as we think about it, but overthrow the government. And that government then would have two mandates. The first mandate would be to ask the United States to leave, and the second mandate would be to start reunification talks with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Because the whole reason we're in the Republic of Vietnam is because of the invitation of the government. And if that government asks us to leave, we don't really have a legally viable reason to stay. Then you'd be an invader, you'd be an occupier, which goes against the narrative of why we're in the Republic of Vietnam. So it's a decisive plan, but it's not decisive in terms of a military defeat. It's decisive in terms of bringing about a political reality that the United States cannot reason with. As you start to look at what's going on in the later part of 1967, this fits into Westmoreland's idea of what this conflict means. Westmoreland knows what brought the French down, and that's Dien Bien Phu, which is a conventional assault. And so what he's going to concentrate on is making sure that he doesn't get defeated militarily. It's not that he's ignorant of the political problems in the Republic of Vietnam. It's more that that's not something he can realistically solve. He can't force political changes on the government of the Republic of Vietnam. He can't institute good governance practices in the villages and provinces. If the South Vietnamese can't or won't do that, there's not much he can do. But what he can do is affect the conventional side of this conflict. We often think about Vietnam in terms of an irregular or an insurgent conflict. And it's true that there are a lot of insurgents and irregular forces, but there are also a lot of conventional forces too. And so what Westmoreland's going to concentrate on is relieving the burden of the conventional fight from the Republic of Vietnam. So he's going to focus on fighting the People's Army of Vietnam deployed in the Republic of Vietnam, the PAVN. He's going to allow the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, to concentrate on pacification efforts and to concentrate on fighting the People's Liberation Armed Forces, which is the armed wing of the National Liberation Front, an umbrella organization that is a front for the communists, but it's supposed to represent all of these dissatisfied factions inside of the Republic of Vietnam. And the idea is, if Westmoreland can create this breathing space, if he can create security situations that allow the Republic of Vietnam to consolidate, not only in the urban areas, but also increasingly in the rural areas, then they can start to put in these best practices for governance. They can start to create a more effective government model that will satisfy a lot of these political concerns. So when Westmoreland is looking at enemy action in the later part of 1967, it seems like the enemy is really active in the conventional sense. You start to see regimental size engagements with PAVN forces in the Central Highlands. The Battle of Dak To is one of those. And when 68 starts and the siege of Khe Sanh begins, it's a couple of divisions attacking the Marines in Khe Sanh, which seems a lot like Dien Bien Phu. And so from Westmoreland's position, he doesn't want to miss the forest for the trees. And it seems like the forest is this concentrated conventional attack. And so he's going to focus on that. He understands that there's something going on, and he sees the enemy acting in a way that seems to validate a lot of the intelligence indicators that he has. There's also something else happening as we look at 1967. And that is, in the United States, the Johnson administration is going to call Westmoreland back to talk about the successes of the Vietnam campaign. And so Westmoreland's going to talk about how effective the soldiers are at fighting the Vietnamese, at killing the enemy, and how the end starts to come into view, that the enemy is relatively weak, and it seems like you're in a much better position in 67 than you were in 65. And so when there's discussion of a timeline, when do we think we may be able to start to talk about finishing this or winning this, Westmoreland's going to talk about things in terms of around 2 years. Maybe in 2 years we can start to talk about victory. That is going to clash with the Tet Offensive. And that's going to be part of that cognitive dissonance that's going to be very difficult for people in the United States to understand how you have such optimism in D.C., such optimism in Saigon, with seeming chaos in the rest of South Vietnam. When we look at the scale of the attack, each one of these red dots is a significant attack in the Tet Offensive. Now, you're going to have battalion-size elements or regimental-size elements attacking some of these urban centers. But they're not going to be attacking in mass the way that we think about a battalion or a brigade moving. They're going to have several, a dozen, maybe 24 or more targets inside of an urban center. And so you won't mass the way that we think of when we think about battalions attacking or brigades attacking. And this can be kind of confusing in terms of answering that question of why does it take so long for Westmoreland to understand what's going on? Well, remember, he's concentrated on the fight in Khe Sanh, which is in the far north of the Republic of Vietnam. And you've got 2 divisions and other associated PAVN units attacking the Marines, 2 conventional divisions deployed. And then you start to get reports of widespread attacks of relatively minor size. Now, you do have battalions and regiments, but again, they're not moving as whole units. They're going to be attacking in maybe company-size elements, attacking in smaller elements across urban areas. And so when we think about mass, it's not massed in the way that Westmoreland is thinking about it, but it is massed in a way that Le Duan is thinking about massing his efforts, because he's trying to get the urban centers onto his side. The National Liberation Front, the communist infrastructure that they have in the Republic of Vietnam, they've got inroads in the rural areas. They've got a large presence. Almost half are either under the control or at least under the influence of the communist infrastructure in terms of the rural areas. But you don't have near that penetration in the urban areas. And so what Le Duan's trying to do with his offensive, this general uprising, general offensive, is try to gain control of these these urban areas, because that's where the money is, that's where the policymakers are, and that's where the center of power is for his enemy. So you're going to take your resources from the rural areas and you're going to throw everything at the urban centers. Because again, we're looking at this in terms of changing the political dynamic, not just in terms of the military dynamic. Whereas what Westmoreland's looking at more so is what is the enemy doing militarily? Where is the enemy concentrating his military forces? One of the problems that this causes is the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, when they're launching this Tet Offensive in the South, you're taking a lot of that infrastructure that you'd built up over the years and you're moving it from the rural areas and attacking those urban centers. Of course, the Tet Offensive is going to be a tactical catastrophe for the North. It's going to end up really eroding and degrading their control over these rural areas. It's going to set them back quite a bit. One of the difficulties, though, is it seems that would create a center of opportunity for the South Vietnamese, but they don't have the ability to really capitalize on that. And so you've got these rural areas that are now in play, but neither side can really exploit that opportunity because the tactical losses that the North realizes in these urban areas, or because MACV and the Republic of Vietnam are still trying to understand what actually is happening in the Tet Offensive. One of the problems that Le Duan's trying to wrestle with throughout the Vietnam conflict, and is evident in the Tet Offensive, is how do you play the socialist world? How do you make sure you're getting support from both sides? And his focus on these urban areas is actually going to frustrate the Chinese. The Chinese are looking to help support the Vietnamese in their revolutionary efforts. They want to do so at the expense of the Soviets. The Soviets definitely want to help the Vietnamese, but it'd be better if they could help the Vietnamese at the expense of the Chinese. And so both the Soviets and the Chinese are wrestling with how do we make sure that the North Vietnamese are in our camp. And one of the ways that you do that is by the revolutionary model that they're executing. And this urban focus is definitely not part of Mao's revolutionary framework. From Mao's perspective, this protracted war that Giap talked about, this focus on the rural areas, that's actually the best way to do it. It worked in China. But the problem that Lê Duan has is he doesn't want a protracted war. Remember, he wants a decisive conflict in the way that we think about a decisive conflict. And if you continue along this road of rural revolution, it's only going to take a longer amount of time. And so he's going to alienate the Chinese to some degree in order to try to seek this decisive conflict. What we're going to see, though, is Tet is decisive in a way, but maybe not the way that we often think about decisive conflicts. Because it is going to change both the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's operational approach. It's going to change the United States and its approach to the war, but it's not going to align with what Lê Duan planned, and it's not going to align with what the United States thought was going to happen. And so we see the Tet Offensive, it opens some opportunities. It's also something that shows the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam from the socialist camp broadly. But that's something that the United States doesn't necessarily have that nuance in our policy. That's not going to come around until we start to look at détente and look at the socialist world in a little bit more nuanced fashion. For the United States, when the Tet Offensive is kicking off, the question is, well, what does this mean? And you've got two different pictures there that I think encapsulate what's going on. One, the smaller inset there, is President Johnson, and he's bent over a model that he has built of Khe Sanh. Because for him, Khe Sanh is the real threat as the Tet Offensive is just beginning. Because he does not want another Dien Bien Phu. Because again, that was the decisive defeat of the French, and he doesn't want that to happen to the United States. And so, when you look at the other picture, which is an artillery piece at Khe Sanh, it shows how the United States is thinking about waging this war. We're really focused on the conventional aspect, and that's one of the reasons why the Tet Offensive seems confusing or hard to grasp, is that it's not a purely military problem. It's a military-assisted political endeavor. And so when you're looking at trying to figure out what the enemy's doing, why are they attacking all over the place? Why are they spreading their combat forces across all of the Republic of Vietnam when they should be massing, when they should be concentrating on some important areas? It's easier to understand why there's some grasping, why it takes a little bit of time for Westmoreland and for the Johnson administration to understand that the real intent, the real main effort, is not in Khe Sanh. The real main effort is in the rest of the Republic of Vietnam. And what's going to happen is throughout the rest of 1968, you're going to see this reaction. You're going to see a lot more aggressiveness in prosecuting the war. To an extent that 1968, by no surprise, is the highest in terms of U.S. killed in action in South Vietnam. That's both because of this aggressive attack that the communists level throughout 1968, but that's also, in point of fact, in the counterattack that Westmoreland and then Abrams is going to continue throughout 1968. They understand that they've got the enemy at a point of weakness, and you should continue to press the advantage. The problem is, this spike is going to resonate at home just as it resonates in South Vietnam. And that's going to be one of those things that is going to cause more doubt and more frustration in the United States. As you have increased casualties, you have increased skepticism. You've got to balance that with the optimistic assessment of the war in 1967 and the optimistic assessment of the counteroffensive that Westmoreland discusses in the early part of the Tet Offensive, where we've got the enemy in a position of weakness. We're going to continue to pour on resources. We're going to continue to attack. The problem is this doesn't seem like success at home. What it seems like is you continue to have increased casualties with not a lot of increased stability, increased security, or real concrete gains that the American people can understand. But it's even more catastrophic for the communists. Out of 124,000 communist fighters committed to the initial assault, you're going to have about 50,000 killed. That's a MACV estimate, but it's not too far outside of reality. So this is a terrible number, 16,000 U.S. killed across all of 1968. But then when you look at the first phase of the Tet Offensive, which is in late January through February 1968, and you've got about 50,000 of both PAVN and the People's Liberation Armed Forces killed, you can see that this tactical catastrophe is much more destructive to the communist forces than it is to MACV forces. One of the biggest problems, though, is what happens to the civilians. Because what this does show for the South Vietnamese is that the promises that the government had about providing security really do not carry as far as they need to. It's understandable that if you live in a rural area cut off from urban centers of power, that you have to make some compromises. The government isn't around as much, it's not in full vigor where you live, so of course you're going to have to make some accommodations to insurgents. But if you're living in a city that seems to be under government control, and then one day all of that is called into question, you can understand why people are very skeptical about government promises of reform, government promises of change. And so one of the things that's amazing is you're going to have 627,000 people homeless, but those 627,000 people are really going to be concentrated in these urban areas that were the place where the government was supposed to have the most control. And so when we look at the implications of the Tet Offensive for the Republic of Vietnam, it's this erosion of the political legitimacy in the minds of a lot of the folks in the Republic of Vietnam. Not to say that the communists offer a viable alternative. That's not the case. That's that failed dichotomy that Le Duan ascribes to, that if you don't like Saigon, that means you like the communist. That's not true. You can not like the government in Saigon and not want to be communist, right? The problem for the government in Saigon is President Tu needs the assent and he needs the dedication of the people of Vietnam to help make this project work. When we look at the Tet Offensive, that one bar kind of obscures the spike. Because it's one thing to say that our highest casualties are in 1968, but this monthly breakdown shows out a little bit more nuance. Those two spikes there are in February 1968 and then again in the summer, July, August of 1968. And so when you look at Tet, and then there's discussion of mini-Tet, and then you've got another third offensive in the last part of 1968. What happens is, as Le Duan is assessing the progress from the first offensive, where you've got 50,000 folks killed, his assessment isn't that, well, we really need to take a knee, we need to wait, this didn't work out. His assessment is, we've got them where we want them, let's do it again. And so then you have mini-Tet in the late spring, early summer of 68, and then you're going to have a third offensive. After the two failed offenses, you're going to have another attack in the last part of 68. This causes an incredible decrease in morale for the fighters in the Republic of Vietnam, for those PAVN and People's Liberation Armed Forces fighters. They had been excited, and the morale was high in 1967 because it seemed like they were on the cusp of victory. That's what their leaders told them. One more push, and then we're going to see this uprising. We're going to see a revolution and a decisive win. That doesn't happen in the Tet holiday of 1968. It doesn't happen again in mini Tet in the middle of 68, and it doesn't happen a third time in the latter part of 68. And so by the end of 1968, you've got not only a heavily attrited enemy in the PAVN and the People's Liberation Armed Forces, you also have a collapse of the morale for these fighters. But that really raises a question. If you've got this collapse of morale in the enemy forces, then why does this seem, in our national narrative, seem to be the decisive campaign that leads to U.S. defeat and the destruction of the Republic of Vietnam? And that's because, in some ways, you can have two losers in a campaign. What's happening inside the United States is you've got Westmoreland pushing for reinforcements, because, again, he sees this as an opportunity that he can exploit. And so he goes to the president and he asks for 200,000 troops. If you get 200,000, I can finally have the combat power I need to really get the enemy to that crossover point where I'm killing them faster than they can reconstitute. This 200,000 troop number doesn't come out of thin air, though, because we've got Johnson, McNamara, Westmoreland, and this is General Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. In 67, he had counseled Westmoreland to ask for 200,000 troops, not just because it wouldn't be a bad idea to have more combat power in South Vietnam, but also because it would force a mobilization of the reserves and National Guard in the United States. One of the things that Chairman Wheeler is concerned about is the United States Strategic Reserve is dwindling. And without a call-up of the National Guard and the reserves, you don't have a strategic reserve, which means if the Soviet Union attacks in Europe, if there's a problem on the Korean Peninsula, you don't have the forces to take care of that without decreasing combat power from Vietnam. Westmoreland doesn't make that decision in 67. He doesn't feel like he needs that many, and he doesn't feel like that's warranted at the time. But after the initial phase of the Tet Offensive, when it looks like you've got the enemy at a point of inflection where maybe you can exploit this success, he makes this call. It wouldn't be 200,000 up front. It'd be an initial phase of about 40,000, and that would allow him to continue operations immediately and continue to vigorously pursue this counterattack. And then sometime in the middle of 1968, you'd have another about 56,000. And then as you get to the latter part of 1968, with presidential approval, with Westmoreland's consent, that it was still necessary, you'd see the rest of that number come in. So this is what's happening as you are trying to talk about what does this mean. Westmoreland's asking for 200,000 more troops. Now, people aren't going to know about that increase until that request for an increase, until the release of the Pentagon Papers, because it's classified. But Johnson disapproves the increase of 200,000. He's going to get a brigade. Westmoreland's going to get a brigade for reinforcements. But Johnson does not want to call up the National Guard. He doesn't want to call up the reserves because he doesn't want to pay that political price. Because what's happening inside the United States is people are trying to weigh these seemingly contradictory messages. That in 1967, Westmoreland tells the National Press Club the end starts to come into view, that the enemy is weak, that he's dispirited. And then the enemy seems to attack everywhere with incredible vigor. And they keep attacking. And that doesn't seem like the action of a weak enemy. And so as casualties are increasing, as the activity is increasing, you start to see an erosion of public support for the war in Vietnam. Not in terms of what we think of as hundreds of thousands of folks protesting the war, but you do hit a crossover point where a majority of folks are now more skeptical about the war than are positive about the war. That's not going to be in the early stage of Tet, but by the time we're in the middle of 1968, more people have doubts about our presence in Vietnam than think it was a good idea. And that's why neither side, either the United States or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, are really able to capitalize on these opportunities in 1968. But Johnson does try to create some type of a political framework that he thinks will create conditions for a positive resolution. He offers to halt bombing in most of North Vietnam. He says he's not going to pursue the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1968. And he wants to talk to the North Vietnamese. He wants to open negotiations, if they would only sit down. But this isn't what Le Duan wanted. Le Duan understands that 1968 is a presidential year, which factors into his planning. But it's not that he wants to take down the Johnson administration. He just wants the United States out of Vietnam. He doesn't care if it's President Johnson or somebody else. But Johnson doesn't feel like he's got the political capital or really the wherewithal to do both the political campaign and try to focus on peace in Vietnam. And what this is going to do is open up a lot of opportunities for discussion inside the United States about what should our Vietnam policy be. You've got an increasingly active anti-war portion of the Democratic Party, but that's not where the political success is going to come from. It's going to come from Nixon. Nixon is going to run on a campaign not of losing the Vietnam War, but of winning it, with the caveat that we're definitely getting out of it, right? He has this plan. He implies it that there's some way I know that we're going to be able to get out of Vietnam. Never says it in those specific words. But what this removal of Johnson from the campaign does is allow a whole host of options to talk about how the U.S. should direct its efforts in Vietnam. And one thing is clear at the end of 1968, and that is that the United States is getting out of the Vietnam War. We'll figure out exactly how that happens, but we are getting out. Nixon's plan is Vietnamization. And so one of the implications of the Tet Offensive for the United States is it really clarifies our policy in Vietnam. We want the Republic of Vietnam to be a viable state, but we also are very clear that we're not going to be there in large numbers. And so Vietnamization starts to be an end in and of itself in terms of troop withdrawals, initially supposed to be conditioned on battlefield realities, but really start to develop their own political inertia. But I don't think that's the most significant change of the Tet Offensive. This is a map of the 1972 Easter Offensive. And I think if you look at the Easter Offensive, you see the real dramatic change and the implication of the Tet Offensive. Because the Easter Offensive is not a lot of irregular forces attacking urban centers in relatively small contingents, trying to create a general uprising. The Easter Offensive is combined arms divisions waging conventional operations to invade the Republic of Vietnam. Why do you wait from 68 to 72 to launch this conventional invasion? Well, one of the reasons why is because you've expended so much combat power in 68 that you really have to take time to regenerate your forces. But it's also this change in operational approach. You've got conventional forces in 68. We had two divisions. There were two PAVN divisions attacking the Marines at Quezon. But those weren't the same type of divisions that are coming in 1972. So you have to get new equipment. You have to do training. You have to come up with new plans. And this shows Le Duan admits the failure of this general uprising and general offensive. There's not going to be a negotiation with a revolutionary government in South Vietnam. What will happen is there will be an invasion of South Vietnam. The North will take over the South and dictate terms to it. That's a very different operational approach than trying to spark a grassroots revolution. And so when we look at this picture in 1975, why isn't 1972 successful if it's still combined arms forces in 1975? Well, the one big difference in 72 and 75 is the United States is not there in 75. Because in 72, we're pulling out. We saw Melvin Laird's graph where in 1972 we'd have 27,000 troops. We still have air power. that's helping the Republic of Vietnam. We still have advisors, and we're still funding them in 1972. But by 75, Nixon's no longer in the White House. The people in the United States are sick of the conflict. And so this combined arms force that starts as a probing attack in 1975 is able to quickly exploit the collapse of the ARVN and brings about what is, in some ways, a decisive campaign. But this isn't the decisive campaign that Le Duan planned with the Tet Offensive. And sometimes I think we fool ourselves when we talk about decisive campaigns in light of leading to an imminent collapse or an imminent resolution of a conflict. Because those are few and far between. They're an ideal, nice when it happens, but oftentimes campaigns can be decisive more in that they change the trend of a conflict. The Tet Offensive is one of those campaigns that changes the trend line of the war. It opens up new opportunities. It creates a new character of that conflict. But both sides have to grapple with what the implications of those changes are. And so in 1968, in some sense, there are opportunities for both the United States, the Republic of Vietnam, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to exploit these opportunities. In hindsight, we can see that the Democratic Republic of Vietnam is more successful in exploiting those realities as a result of the Tet Offensive. But what we can't do is collapse this eventual success into those three snapshots of causal events where we believe that the Tet Offensive is focused on U.S. political support for the war, and they always knew it would be tanks in 1975. There's a whole lot of individual agency, there are a lot of decisions, and a whole host of changes in both the North, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and in the United States between the Tet Offensive and the ultimate resolution of the Vietnam War in 1975. And so I think when we look at decisive conflicts, we should be a little bit more honest about what is decisive. And really, it's that interplay where both sides have an opportunity to exploit these new realities, and the ones that succeed are often more effective at understanding the implications and understanding the new character of the war more rapidly than their adversary. With that, I'd like to take some questions, but I do want to make an announcement. We've got the next installment of our talk will be next month, and it'll be on Iron Marne. Dr. Sean Faulkner is going to be presenting. Also a Wednesday presentation. Yeah. All right. Thank you. We've got, while the mic's coming over here, these are a couple of books I found helpful. Hanoi's War is based on, this is more recent, it incorporates a lot of Vietnamese language sources as well as U.S. language sources. Tet Offensive, A Concise History, if you're looking for a good short book on the Tet Offensive from more the military side, it's very good. And then The Myth of Tet, that talks about a lot of these different interpretations and has pretty good bibliographic references. Victory in Vietnam is an English language translation of the North Vietnamese, now the Vietnamese Military History Group. So this is the communist view of why they were successful in Vietnam, not just the Tet, but the whole Vietnam War. And then Staying the Course is the best priced on the list. It's free. It's a Center for Military History publication, but it talks specifically about combat operations October 1967 through September of 68.
If Le Duan was a political operator in the South before heading up to the Politburo, why was he so far off in his estimation of support for a political uprising in the South cities, in urban areas?
Well, I think ideology can be just as much of an intellectual prison as a paradigm is. So if you look at Westmoreland's view of what's going on, he's filtering that through his paradigm of conventional forces are the most direct threat. Le Duan is interpreting his events through this ideological framework that if people live under a government that is not communist, it's inherently illegitimate. And they obviously don't like that. So they're going to want to throw off an illegitimate government Well, the only replacement of an illegitimate government has to be a legitimate government, which is one that is communist in nature. And what's interesting, though, is that it takes a lot of tries at this to finally have him admit the fact that this revolution is not going to happen the way that he wants it to happen. But I do think it is that ideological prism that he has. But he's successful. He will stay in charge of the Politburo until he dies in the late 70s. Oh, yes, well, here in the blue, and then, Lakers. Oh.
Thanks for your presentation. When did it become apparent to the United States that Ho Chi Minh was no longer the really powerful force in North Vietnamese, that Le Duan was, in essence, calling the shots?
Yeah, well, so Ho Chi Minh dies in 69, and so that's one that's a very definitive. The problem is there's not as much understanding about what's going on in the Politburo. And if you look at that picture where you've got Ho Chi Minh, the poster of Ho Chi Minh behind him, iconography is great in socialist states. So it seems like you've got Ho Chi Minh pushed forward as the face of the government, and that's not just for the international audience, that's also for the people in Vietnam, because Ho Chi Minh had a lot of resonance in terms of Uncle Ho, nationalist freedom fighter. And so he's put forward as this voice of consensus. So even though Le Duan is the power behind the face of Ho Chi Minh, the people inside of Vietnam, for the large part, don't know about Le Duan. And so it's not going to be until after the fact, when we start to understand more of what's going on inside the Politburo, that we start to understand who is really driving decisions inside of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So it's not really during the 60s. It's only going to be as we start to get access to some of the more inner workings of what's going on inside of the Politburo. So, sorry, Lakers and then, yes, sir.
Lady Wong, whatever you pronounce it, wants this uprising to happen. Is the U.S. doing anything to prevent it, other than just like a conventional?
Yeah.
Westmoreland is doing this. His strategy, is there also a strategy in place to prevent this from happening?
So that's one of the things. So MACV is not just focused on the conventional side. You've got what will be the Chords group led by Robert Comer, who's in country, but he's going to be much more prevalent once you start to make some command changes inside of the MACV headquarters. But you've got a whole pacification strategy. The problem is these pacification folks working for Westmoreland, working for non-governmental agencies or other groups, not just the Department of Defense, they run into the same problem of legitimacy in that they aren't Vietnamese. They aren't folks that live there. They don't have any real political leverage. All they have are good ideas. And so that's one of the tensions when we look at pacification efforts writ large. If you don't have legitimacy inside of the populace that you're trying to help, it can be very difficult because at the end of the day, you're an outsider. You may be an interloper. And so it's not that Westmoreland is ignorant of these things. It's just that he understands, I can tell you what the best practices are, I can give you money, I can help you, but if you're not looking for help, and one of the frustrations he has is you've got a lot of corruption inside the government of Vietnam. But he can't fire anybody. He can talk to the political leaders and say, the person in this core tactical zone, that general is no good. Okay, got it. But that general happens to have a lot of political legitimacy, and as President Tu, I can't relieve him because now that would create a new faction that would undercut my political capital inside of the Republic of Vietnam. And so that's the problem that Westmoreland's facing, and that's why he's looking at where can I do the most good, most efficiently, fighting the conventional fight. It's not that he's ignoring this pacification effort. There's a lot of concentration on it, but at the end of the day, the United States and its allies can't do what the Republic of Vietnam government won't do, and bridging that gap is very difficult.
Before I ask my question, I want to show the hands of the people here who are Vietnam vets. Okay. With your history of Vietnam, what do you think I was doing there for 2 years from 1956 to 58?
Oh, so 56 to 58?
What was I doing in Vietnam for 2 years?
Part of the Military Assistance and Advisory Group?
I was in the 8th and 9th grade.
Say again?
I was in the 8th and the 9th grade. Oh. My father was working there with a foreign aid program.
Okay. Okay.
Would you speak to the degree to which the Catholic administration and the Catholic heir to the French system in Saigon was in conflict with the Buddhist population of South Vietnam.
Yeah, and that's definitely going to be much bigger of an issue with Ngo Dinh Diem. And Ngo Dinh Diem is the first prime minister for Bao Dai, but Bao Dai is quickly going to be allowed to retire and do other things. So then Ngo Dinh Diem is going to be the premier of what's going to be the Republic of Vietnam. But that's in the 50s through 1963 when he's overthrown in a coup. Ngo Dinh Diem is an ardent Catholic, and he's going to have his political base is a lot of the Catholics who were mainly from what was then the Democratic Republic of Vietnam during this free flow area. You had about 18 months where you could have free passage between the north and the south of Vietnam. So a lot of Catholics moved from the north down into the south because they didn't want to live under a communist government. And so they become the power behind Ngo Dinh Diem. And that's difficult because most of the people in South Vietnam aren't Catholic, they're Buddhist. Ngo Dinh Diem's not interested necessarily in expanding his political base, and the divisions inside of the country are going to invite the U.S. tacit approval for his overthrow in 1963. After 63, it's not going to be as much along the lines of religious ideologies as much as it is military power brokers, and so you'll have a succession of military leaders who become political leaders and either throw off the uniform or are part of different military juntas. But it's really, after 63, it's how are these folks working with the ARVN as the political arbitrators? And that gets back to your question about pacification. The political leaders throughout the 60s really have to worry about alienating the ARVN, and that's why you can't fire folks you know are bad if they're senior in your military, because if you do, now you've cleaved your political support maybe in half, and now they might be a faction that would overthrow you. So the Catholic aspect is much more in the 50s, early 60s, and during the rest of the 60s, it's maybe a little bit more of the internecine military struggles for political support.
First off, thank you for your course here today. Quick question, when did the United States Army become aware of the offensive that turned out to be what we now call the Tet Offensive?
Oh, so the Tet, the Tet holiday, when everything goes. And that's this happens. There are a couple of attacks that are launched about a day or two early because they're using a different calendar in the south than they are in the north. And that lack of coordination gives a little bit of an indicator, but not to the scale. And so they're aware that, man, something happened. But the question is, what is it that happened? Is this a diversion from what's really going on in Khe Sanh? Well, what becomes evident as these attacks are such broad scale and really hold specifically in places like Hue and Saigon, you're going to have not just days of attacks, but weeks of attacks. So it quickly becomes evident that, Khe Sanh might have been the diversion. Now, what's really the main effort is all these urban areas under attack. So within hours, it's evident that something's changed, and within a day or two, you realize, okay, something is different, but it's not until a week, maybe a little bit more, that they start to understand the scale of the problem in a place like Hue, and how do you start to get combat forces there. So in terms of understanding where the new concentrations are, that's going to take days, if not a week, but in terms of understanding everything is under attack, that is very early on.
Could you comment on the impact of the release of the Pentagon Papers and how people view Vietnam?
Mm-hmm. So Pentagon Papers are going to come out in the early 1970s, and it's going to really move the domestic conversation from one of skepticism, where you've got a lot of skepticism building throughout the 1960s in terms of what's going on, but you don't necessarily have that cynicism that happens after the Pentagon Papers. Because what the Pentagon Papers show is it's not people making good faith errors of assessment or focusing on an indicator that maybe in hindsight looks like it's irrelevant, but at the time you could have an agreement to disagree. What the Pentagon Papers show a little bit more clearly is that this is a concerted effort to put the best spin on things and to hide the facts of what's going on. And that now moves the conversation from one of skepticism, where maybe we can agree to disagree about interpretations, to one of cynicism that I can't trust what the government tells me is true because there may be an active campaign to hide the truth.
Yes. How much of an impact did Westmoreland's order of battle controversy have on the outcome of the Tet Offensive?
Not that much. And so that order of battle controversy.
Would you repeat the question, please?
Sorry. So thank you. The question is, how much impact did Westmoreland's order of battle controversy have on the Tet Offensive? And that's something Ed Moyse, in the midst of the Tet Offensive, goes into some detail about this discussion of the order of battle controversy. What's happening is you get into 1967, the close of 1967, inside of MACV, is what's the right number of folks to count as far as the enemy? And that seems like maybe a silly question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? But that's in terms of looking at it as far as conventional forces. The debate is, are the People's Liberation Armed Forces, are they part of the enemy order of battle? MACV is willing to include them because they've got training, they've got some organization, they clearly are conducting combat operations, sure. But then there's another echelon of forces, the communist infrastructure. A lot of those guys are focused more on political maneuverings and ideological formation. Are they part of the order of battle? Maybe, maybe not. Well, what about some regional forces, maybe militia forces that aren't militia in terms of the Republic of Vietnam, but militia in terms of the communist effort? So they're part-time guerrillas. They're not going to go out and leave the hamlet to go fight an insurgency. What they are going to do is fight U.S. or South Vietnamese troops that come around. And that's where the debate kind of breaks down is, are those folks part of this order of battle? And you've got institutions like the CIA that say, yes, they are, because they are combatants, they are fighting, and if they're fighting, you should include them in your order of battle. It's a logical extension. Westmoreland's argument, or MACV's argument against that, is they're not part of the deployable forces. They aren't really moving around the country. We just happen to run into them. They're not well trained, they're not well equipped, they're not well organized, so I can't count everybody that can throw a stone. Right? Now, that's putting it in very simplistic terms, but that's what it boils down to. Westmoreland argues that they're giving more clarity in terms of who's actually fighting, but this gets back to your discussion about the Pentagon Papers, because one of the arguments is one of the reasons why MACV is making this move to clarify, if you want to look at it that way, who's fighting, is so the Johnson administration can say we're actually killing a larger proportion of forces, because if you've got a pie and then the pie is smaller, well, each piece is now bigger. So now my numbers look even better because there were less to begin with, as opposed to if you expand the number, well, now the people you're killing are proportionally less. And so that's one of the arguments or points of frustration. But in terms of how it impacted the Tet Offensive, I don't think it's that big a deal, because we're not talking about necessarily doubling the size. It's more, are you going to increase it by 25%, 30%, not necessarily by 100%?
Weren't a lot of the attacking communist forces, including those local guerrillas, village militia, whatever?
Yeah, so a lot of these folks are, yeah, so the question is, are a lot of the attacking forces in the Tet Offensive, were they these militia forces? A lot of the folks attacking are going to be People's Liberation Armed Forces. You will have some of the communist infrastructure, these militia folks, mobilized and pulled out. But again, the Tet Offensive is a tactical catastrophe. So yes, they're going to take part in this, but they're also going to be killed in droves very early on. And so what happens is in the first phase, from that late January through February phase, where you've got 50,000 folks killed, a lot of those 50,000 are going to be these communist infrastructure folks, these People's Liberation Armed Forces folks, the people that are holding down the fort in the rural areas where the communists actually have the most sway and influence. So in some ways, their use in the Tet Offensive actually erodes communist support in the rural areas, more so than the actions, the combat actions of the Tet Offensive. So in that sense, it actually sets the communists back more, because once the ARVN and MACV are able to start concentrating on these groups, they are killed in large numbers very quickly. But it's not something that's, if they weren't there, it wouldn't have changed it fundamentally.
Do you happen to remember what Westmoreland said to the National Press Club in 1967 that got awful lot of stuff going?
Yeah, so he talks about, and again, paraphrasing, but the end starts to come into view, is the way that he phrases this idea of what's the assessment of the United States. The end starts to come into view, and so that will get, not contorted, but discussion of light at the end of the tunnel, things like that. But it really is, the end starts to, and he's not talking about immediately. He's discussing, in 2 years, the end will start to come into view. So in 69, I can give you more concrete information about maybe the immediacy of victory. What ends up happening is, the way we remember that now, though, is much more the end is in sight in 67, and that's not really the case. The problem, though, is that rosy assessment conflicts with what people are seeing in the Tet Offensive, and it doesn't look like it's a weak enemy in 68. So there's some nuance that Westmoreland has, but that nuance quickly is overrun in the reality of the Tet Offensive, definitely in terms of the domestic conversation.
Was Westmoreland deceived from...
So the question is, was Westmoreland deceived? No. He's a 4-star general. He's not deceived. I think the better question is, did he create an environment where uncomfortable truths weren't able to percolate up? Now, there's a debate in terms of how much the Johnson administration is leaning on Westmoreland to give a rosy assessment. Is the Johnson administration forcing these overly optimistic numbers or overly optimistic kill reports? There's nothing definitive in terms of, there's not a memo to Westmoreland that says you will not be Chief of Staff of the Army unless you can have this number of killed a month in Vietnam. What is clear, though, is the president clearly wants some success. Westmoreland understands success is something that you have to make real, and one easy way to understand that or communicate that is to talk about dead bodies. Because at the end of the day, it's a biological issue, and that is it takes around 15 years to make a fighter, right? Because you can't give a 5-year-old a gun. So if you kill a large number of enemy fighters, then you are degrading their combat capacity. And if you do that in large enough numbers, well, they'll eventually collapse. I don't think it's that he is lying to himself. I don't think that he is lied to. I think it's more that he's created an environment that he maybe did not understand the second and third order implications of what happens if you start to disincentivize accurate or negative reporting, right? So if somebody realizes I'm not going to get promoted if I don't show that I had certain number of combat patrols and certain number of KIA during my tour in Vietnam, and I know I really want to get promoted, well, guess what? I'm going to create a pretty optimistic combat report because nobody's there to check, right? So we saw some blood trails. Well, those blood trails weren't from one person, they were from 3. We found some fingers and a foot, not from one person, had to be from multiple people. And so that's how it kind of rapidly escalates.
Is in the grand, the history of warfare and ancient wars to modern, is the Tet Offensive significant in the history of all of war? And does it stand out as this is a really this is too much to? Is it historical? Is it
Okay, so is it historical in the broad scope? And that is, I am not confident enough in my abilities to say that yes, it is or it's not. What I will say is why it's important is the fact that you've got one adversary who is leveraging military components or military aggression in an overtly political framework. And for our studies and our cultural approach to war, we often want to separate those two, that there are military problems and there are political problems and they're not nested together. But from the North Vietnamese side, they are together. And so we've got this idea of Dao Tron, the struggle, that's both armed struggle and political struggle, and they are interweaved at every level. And so I think it's important in terms of a campaign to understand that this bifurcated view of military and political solutions, they're not as separate in everybody's understanding of warfare, and that's why I think it's an important thing to look at.
If the combat capabilities of the North Vietnamese and I guess the Viet Cong were significantly degraded in 1968. What did the United States do after then to ensure that those the weaknesses continued?
Well, what's going on once Nixon gets in? Nixon can be much more aggressive than Johnson in terms of prosecuting the war. So what Johnson can't do is expand the war to Laos and Cambodia in a large scale. You can have some low-level covert actions. Nixon can do that in a much more aggressive way. Nixon can mine Haiphong Harbor. Nixon can expand the bombing in North Vietnam. But that's all because Nixon is making one thing very clear. We're getting out, right? So he's like the gunfighter who's shooting as he's leaving the bar. Okay, it's aggressive, and that's great, but you're not staying for the fight. So Nixon and his administration are trying to do what they can to make sure that the North Vietnamese understand we are going to back the Republic of Vietnam. So you've got this expansion of the military effort to a degree. You also have an increase in arming the Republic of Vietnam. So they are going to have the best that we can give them. The problem is a lot of the things that the North Vietnamese are getting are from the Chinese and the Soviets, and one thing Nixon's trying to do is balance the Soviets against the Chinese with détente, and so he doesn't really want to alienate either side. So you're not going to say, we're going to lean on them to not supply the Vietnamese, but we don't really have the ability to stop that in large numbers, right? So that's another one of those concerns. Nixon can be aggressive. He can try to make sure that the North Vietnamese understand his seriousness, but at the end of the day, he's already admitted to the American people there is a time horizon. The United States is leaving. And the socialist world, he can try to make it worth their while to downplay the Vietnamese conflict, but there's still some assistance that they're getting from the broader socialist world. So you have some ability to erode that or maintain that degraded capability, but you can't stop it completely. Kent State, yes. So in terms of the protest. Right, so that protest is the protest is as a result of expanding the operations, and so people are protesting that, yes. And that, again, is another one of those symbolic events in, I think, that kind of shows the domestic turmoil inside the United States. Yeah.
In the Tet Offensives of 68, Viet Cong guerrillas from all over the South attacked cities, were vectored in to attack cities by Hanoi, and their ranks were decimated. So after the Tet Offensives, there weren't many Viet Cong guerrillas left. So with no guerrilla forces in the South, does Hanoi attempt to continue guerrilla operations throughout the South or abandon that effort? And if the activities are continued, what forces do they use?
That's a question that's of some debate. So Wilbanks is of the argument that, yes, you've got this elimination of the Viet Cong, and you'll see Viet Cong elements that are going to take part in 72 and 75, but those are reflagged Viet Cong units or People's Liberation Armed Forces units. They're not guerrilla units in the way that they were in 68 and prior. Ed Moyse is a little bit more skeptical of that argument, that there's still some of this irregular fighting going on. I think the right answer is somewhere in the middle, in that you do have insurgent warfare that continues. It's not that combat operations cease after 68 in terms of the People's Liberation Armed Forces. They are still going to be active, but to your point, not nearly to the scale that they were prior to the Tet Offensive. And when you do see PLAF units coming in 72 and 75, they're going to be part of this broader combined arms force, and a lot of them are going to be reflag units. And so I think if you look at where the North Vietnamese are focusing their efforts, it's not rebuilding a communist infrastructure. They're not rebuilding an irregular fighting force for another general offensive and general uprising. They're going to keep that going as much as they can, just to continue combat operations in the South, to continue to erode the Republic of Vietnam and U.S. forces. But their real focus after 68 is going to be on creating larger conventional forces that are going to take part in the operations in 72 and 75. So it's not that they stop guerrilla operations. It's that they're not going to rebuild the capacity they lost. And to your point, they are greatly degraded as a result of the Tet Offensive in '68. I think again.
Walter Cronkite came out against the war. Was it before or after Johnson declined, and that affected the public opinion in the States?
Yeah, so he's going to come out, and to say he comes out against the war, he is, during the Tet Offensive, he is doing a documentary, and he's going to have some footage of Hue. And then he comes back, puts it together as part of a long-form television program to talk about what's going on. And he's going to say that what this offensive shows, and this is before Johnson decides not to run again. He's going to tell the American people that what's clear is that the Vietnam War is now at a stalemate. And what we should do is seek to negotiate with the North Vietnamese, not as a vanquished people, but as a people who did their best, but it's a stalemate. And so I hesitate to say that he doesn't come out against the war in terms that he says, this is a failure, we need to leave, it's already lost, pull up the tents, we're going home. He is more talking about the fact that 67 and this overly optimistic assessment that the enemy is degraded, the enemy's weak, in a couple of years we can start to see the end come into view. That's not the case anymore. We're at a plateau. And the problem is, if we increase forces, the enemy has shown his ability to increase forces as well. And we're going to continue to match each other soldier for soldier, and we can't get an overwhelming majority or an overwhelming element of combat power, so we can't win in the way that we think about it. We should negotiate, much in the way that we negotiated with the Chinese and the Koreans in their Korean conflict, that we realize it's a stalemate, and so you have to come to some other accommodation. So he comes out not necessarily against the war, but more in reframing the war is not going as successfully as the government said it was in '67. Maybe the United States should have a different approach to the war in '68. But that does resonate inside of the discussion, not to the point of collapsing support for the war, but in terms of showing there's that growing skepticism that we talked about. All right. Well, thank you very much.